Dear participants, welcome to the 11th Sea Change webinar, the first one in the 2013 series. And I would like to thank those who came extra early because we saw that some people were here already 30 minutes ago. Maybe there was some confusion in the time zone, but thank you for being here. This webinar is titled Monitoring and Evaluation of Climate Change Adaptation. What can we learn from existing climate change adaptation M&E frameworks and principles? I see that right now we have 47 participants, and with over 300 registrants, I'm expecting some more people to log in over the next minutes. My name is Dennis Boers, and I'm the Sea Change team leader. And given that I'll be presenting this webinar, I'll let our Sea Change M&E expert give the introduction.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. My name is Paul Bacon, and as a warm-up towards the Climate Change M&E panel discussions at the South Asian Evaluation Conclave, which takes place in Kathmandu from February the 26th to March the 1st, 2013, this webinar will summarize the advantages, the disadvantages, the applicability, and the lessons learned from 8 climate change adaptation M&E frameworks, systems, and principles documents. Okay, we're looking at 8 documents, and the 8 documents to be reviewed in this webinar are as follows. Number 1 is the UNDP Proposed Framework for Monitoring Adaptation to Climate Change, which was written in 2007. Number 2, Evaluation of Adaptation to Climate Change from a Development Perspective, written in 2008 by IDS, GEF-EO, and DFID. Number 3, Synthesis Report on Efforts Undertaken to Monitor and Evaluate the Implementation of Adaptation Projects, Policies and Programs, written in 2010 by UNFCCC. Number 4, Tracking Progress for Effective Action, written in 2011 by GEF and Climate Eval. Okay. Just a reminder, all of these documents can actually be accessed through the link on the screen, www.seachange.org/node/1480. Okay, there are four remaining documents that we are reviewing as part of this webinar. Number 5, Learning to Adapt, Monitoring and Evaluation Approaches in CCA and DRR, written in 2011 by SCR. Number 6, IIED Climate Change Working Paper 1, Tracking Adaptation and Measuring Development, which was written in 2011. Number 7, Making Adaptation Count, which was written in 2011 by GIZ and WRI. And finally, number 8, Adaptme, Toolkit for Monitoring and Evaluation of Adaptation Activities, written in 2011 by UKCIP. Okay, this webinar will guide you through these documents at a high pace of 4 minutes per publication, informing you about the approach or perspective taken by the authors, how these publications are interlinked, what their specific applicability is, and what can be learned. What are the key issues to be taken into account when monitoring and evaluating climate change adaptation interventions? Okay, just a quick note about Sea Change itself. Some of the attendees this afternoon are already Sea Change members and already know about us. But for those who are new to Sea Change, I would like to explain that Sea Change is a community of practice with the current 540 members. The community of practice develops a culture of high quality and rigorous M&E frameworks, approaches and methodologies for responses and interventions to climate change related practices in Southeast Asia and beyond. Webinars are one way in which Sea Change is currently sharing knowledge to improve M&E practice related to climate change interventions. Next to webinars, we also send out a weekly newsletter. We maintain a resource library. We support our members in speaking engagements at conferences, and we also support our members in publishing their work. Again, for more information, you can find it at our website, www.seachangecop.org. Okay, let me now introduce you to our presenter, Mr. Dennis Bors. Dennis Bors is a Sea Change team leader. He is responsible for managing the Sea Change community of practice and the online knowledge platform on the M&E of climate change interventions. Dennis has worked globally as a humanitarian sustainable development professional. He has diverse experience in change management, monitoring and evaluation, disaster risk reduction, operations management and staff capacity building.
Thank you, Paul. Let me introduce our new M&E expert to you, Mr. Paul Bacon. With over 15 years international experience in a range of countries, sectors and development organizations, Mr. Bacon will be of great value to the community. His development work began with VSO in PNG, but for the past 6 years Paul has been based in Cambodia, working in Cambodia and the region on projects with government, ministries and international and local NGOs. His monitoring and evaluation background evolved from his experience in management information system development, information management and related data collection and analysis. And this first webinar of 2013 is also Paul's first webinar experience. Paul, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Okay, just a little bit of logistics information for this webinar session. The webinar presentation itself will take 40 to 45 minutes. After the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers. Any questions that have not been answered during the 20 to 30 minute Q&A session will be answered offline and published on our website. We will also provide a recording of the webinar. Okay, during the Q&A session, you can raise your hand and ask a question verbally by the software, obviously. If you can see that, so you can raise your hand. Or even simpler, you can type your questions in the question field in the software, after which we will present the questions to our presenters. Typing the question is really the easiest because you can already send in your questions during the presentation, so we recommend that way. As said, any questions that have not been answered during the 20 to 30 minute Q&A session will be answered offline and published on our website, together with a recording of the webinar. If your question has not been answered at the end of the Q&A session and it has been entered into the question window, then we will make sure it gets answered. Okay, with this introduction over, I now should stop talking and hand over the microphone to Sea Change team leader, Mr. Dennis Bors. Thanks, Dennis. You can take it from here.
Thank you, Paul. And with that, we start immediately with the proposed UNDP framework for monitoring adaptation to climate change. This one was written in 2007, and the actual framework that you're seeing here on the screen, the graphical representation, was made in 2008 and presented to UNDP staff at a training. The framework is developed from UNDP's experience with the unique challenges inherent to climate change adaptation projects. Two of these challenges being, first of all, that climate change adaptation cuts across numerous development objectives, and that secondly, the adaptation is not simply an outcome, but rather a diverse collection of ongoing processes that enable the achievement of development objectives under changing conditions. This framework came into existence based on the Global Environment Facility's priority for programming through the Special Climate Change Fund, the SCCF, and the Least Developed Countries Fund, the LDCF. And the LDCF is designed to support projects addressing urgent and immediate adaptation needs in the least developed countries as identified by the National Adaptation Programs of Action, or NAPAs. The SCCF is designed to finance adaptation activities that increase the resilience of national development sectors to the impacts of climate change through a focus on long-term planned responses, particularly in water resources, land, agriculture, health, infrastructure development, disaster preparedness, and in fragile ecosystems and coastal zones. To fulfill the mandates of these funds, the draft M&E framework for adaptation presented here is organized according to 7 thematic areas. And these thematic areas you see to the left in this figure: agriculture, water, health, disaster risk reduction, coastal environments, natural resource management. And as said as point 2, the actual adaptation is a diverse collection of ongoing processes, and that is what you find in the middle part, the adaptation processes being policy and planning, capacity building and awareness, information management, investment decisions, and practices, livelihoods and resource management. The advantages of this framework are that it is an established framework used by UNDP since 2007, though the actual graphical representation has not been officially published. It gives a good consideration of particular climate change adaptation intervention contexts, situations, and policy and program levels. It works from a thematic area down to a portfolio of programs and projects or policy and other types of adaptation processes. It follows the logical framework approach, and it includes Millennium Development Goals. And indicators are provided with good and specific examples that can be readily applied. Disadvantages are that the framework doesn't follow a clear step-by-step approach. You don't really see where the user would start and finish. And there's not much mention of possible timeframes for applying the evaluation framework. Looking at the specific applicability, this one would be focusing on national adaptation programs of action under Special Climate Change Fund and resilience under the Least Developed Countries Fund. It could apply to broad, well-established development and multi-bilateral programs in various sectors that need to consider some candidate indicators for climate change adaptation interventions. Although, of course, these should be carefully considered and not just cosmetically bolted on. That brings us to the second framework that we are reviewing here, which is IDS Sussex GEF and DFID Evaluation of Adaptation to Climate Change, a Development Perspective. This desk review examines current climate change adaptation interventions and identifies the next steps that are required to develop frameworks for assessing such CCAI. And I'll use the abbreviation every now and then because it's quite long to say climate change adaptation interventions every time. The review states that evaluations of adaptation interventions rarely occur, and when it does happen, it happens post hoc. After reviewing the Global Environment Facility database of evaluations, the authors noted that the evaluation methodologies could be improved by focusing on the criteria of a successful adaptation intervention. Coming to a consensus about what is a successful intervention is noted as one of the main components in developing a framework for evaluating climate change adaptation interventions. The authors promote the concept of embedding adaptation into broader development agendas. This framework gives a good explanation of adaptation theory, and it includes maladaptation. And it gives a synthesis of other frameworks. But we have to keep in mind that this was in 2008, so there weren't that many other frameworks yet at this point. It guides users through a full consideration process of important aspects to be taken into account when developing adaptation interventions. And it uses a useful pyramid diagram of international to household levels with accompanying candidate indicators for all of these levels. The actual framework only drops out at the end of the document and is not really clear on the steps to be followed by the user. Indicators are given for all intervention levels, but the number of indicators given is quite limited. The specific applicability of this framework would be for community and household levels. It could be useful for application at these levels. as these are not seemingly included to such detail in some of the other frameworks. Looking at the type of programs, then given that the authors promote the concept of embedding adaptation into broader development agendas, it could very well be used for programs and projects where climate change is being mainstreamed into them. The third report or framework that we look at is the synthesis report on efforts undertaken to monitor and evaluate the implementation of adaptation projects, policies and programs, and the cost and effectiveness of completed projects, policies and programs, and the views on lessons learned, good practices, gaps and needs of the UNFCCC. And I have to say it's only 15 pages, and with that it is the shortest report with the longest name. When you look at the middle part that's gray here in this figure, it's called Adaptation Policy Process. And although it says Adaptation Policy Process, the focus is not that much on policy. It's more on programs and projects. And if you look at the steps of this adaptation policy process, then it goes from a needs assessment to objectives, to inputs, to outputs. Hey, where did the intervention go? And then it goes from outputs to outcomes to impact. It's basically a logical framework approach where the intervention itself was forgotten. It is called a framework for evaluating adaptation projects, policies and programs, but it does lack guidance. I also think it's not meant in that sense as guidance, but merely recaptures earlier discussions on monitoring and evaluating adaptation projects, policies and programs within the UNFCCC. The advantages are that it gives guidance on how to develop and use adaptation indicators. It recognizes that there are different policy and program levels. And it links to the work of the GEF and UKCIP on M&E and the work of UNDP on vulnerability reduction assessment. The disadvantages are that it's not a distinct framework and no step-by-step approach towards implementation. There is a very limited number of high-level process indicators given, and the lessons learned and good practice page comes to some conclusions that leave room for misinterpretation, and no real new lessons learned are introduced. One recommendation, for example, is to make use of existing monitoring and evaluation systems to the extent possible. And this might be well intended, but it could be misinterpreted as making use of what is there without seeking to develop new ideas. What if current programs can be very well captured with purely quantitative M&E methods and would focus on output and only to a limited extent on process? Would that then rule out mixed method approaches in climate change adaptation intervention settings, focusing on the actual adaptation process? As such, be a bit careful when reading through the lessons learned and the good practice page. With respect to the specific applicability, it is good to scan through, but the ideas and the guidance presented can be very broadly applied. The fourth report is really not a framework, it's a draft study of frameworks, and as such it doesn't present a framework itself. It's written by Harris Sanauja. It is a very interesting recap of previous reports, and a small summary coming down to the following 4 points would be that 1. Adaptation to climate change is inherently complex as it involves many disciplines, stakeholders, technologies and actors. And this complexity makes monitoring and evaluating adaptation interventions a very challenging task. The literature addresses the complexity of adaptation by designing M&E frameworks that narrow the scope of adaptation. This has been done by structuring the M&E framework according to scales, sectors and processes, and through developing a range of indicators. The second point coming from this report would be that the variation in terms of scope of adaptation is vast, encompassing many different actors, issues and disciplines. As a means of synergizing with current development objectives, it is recommended to align adaptation efforts in some way with existing development objectives. This could be the Millennium Development Goals, poverty reduction strategy papers, as well as national adaptation programs of action, if relevant. A third point is that defining a climate change adaptation intervention according to scales allows an M&E framework to focus on specific stakeholders and institutions at each scale. And as a last point, it says to limit also the focus to a number of thematic areas, like the thematic areas in the UNDP framework's approach. Having said that, don't limit too much. The cross-sectoral nature of climate change also creates opportunities. Advantages. It's a strong background document with good synthesis and consideration of previous frameworks, including UNDP, UNFCCC and IDS Sussex. It gives a good overview of most of the indicators presented in previous reports. And it presents a number of guiding questions to develop a foundation for a climate change intervention M&E framework. And I want to take a moment to come to those guiding questions. The report provides some of these questions, and one is, for example, looking at the assessment of climate change situation in its context. The second looks at the assessment of the M&E in an intervention and placing the M&E in its context. It makes you think of the functional M&E capacity that is needed in a climate change adaptation intervention. And it questions whether your strategy is in line with the basic principles of enhancing adaptive capacity. Another guiding question is towards the capability of M&E in the bigger picture. Policy, legislation, national support structures, government targets and baselines, sectoral focus on climate change adaptation, earmarked funding, the academic and NGO capacity towards adaptation interventions in the country, HR capacity, a number of pages that really make you focus and rethink the elements that you need to take into account. Apart from that, a useful set of 9 national climate change adaptation frameworks is presented. A disadvantage would be that it's not a distinct framework or methodology with steps as such, but they also don't pretend that it should be. Specific applicability. This is an essential prerequisite read before starting to develop your own M&E climate change adaptation intervention framework. The fifth, and I'm proud for everyone who's hanging in there because I know that these 8 reports are quite dry at times, and I know it because I've been through all of them. The fifth is called Learning to Adapt by Paula Silva Villanueva, Monitoring and Evaluation Approaches in Climate Change Adaptation, Disaster Risk Reduction, Challenges, Gaps and Ways Forward. This paper situates the M&E discussion at the interface of adaptation, disaster risk management and development. The paper examines current M&E efforts in adaptation and disaster risk reduction, comparing methodological aspects and the conceptual underpinnings of existing practice, pointing to gaps and limitations. Based on these limitations, the paper presents a set of ADAPT principles, which is what you see here on the screen. Adaptive, dynamic, active, participatory and thorough, to facilitate the development of M&E frameworks for interventions that aim to contribute to integrated adaptation processes. 3 key issues are identified by this research. Well, there are more, but I'll pick out 3. Deterministic approaches focus on inputs and outputs, not on processes. A focus on outputs and results tends to stress the evaluation of the delivery of adaptation interventions and immediate reductions in risk, sidelining the long-term developmental context. In order to support adaptive management and learning, a shift in focus to process-based indicators is required in order to allow for a holistic monitoring and evaluation that gains a deeper understanding of the adaptation process. Second point is that most approaches remain static rather than dynamic. The evaluation of adaptation has been dominated by a focus on climate change impacts and static quantitative indicators, which does not capture the high levels of uncertainty and complexity that is part of climate change adaptation interventions. And a third key issue, effectiveness and efficiency still predominate as key principles. Current evaluation approaches focus on measuring the effectiveness, achievement of results, and efficiency in monetary value in terms of risk and capacity to manage stresses and shocks. However, existing approaches are not run against indicators of maladaptation, such as the distribution of vulnerability. A lot of conceptual thinking is drawn out by following the framework and by reading through this document. It is a very interesting recap of current approaches, and it splits them by M&E methodology. So it looks at 4 different methodologies: input, output and outcome evaluation, process-based evaluation, evaluation of behavioral change, and economic evaluations. And that is an interesting approach taken here compared to previous reports. It's also interesting with the ADAPT principles for generating climate change adaptation intervention indicators and developing the M&E framework. Disadvantages are that it may be hard to implement because it's quite broad and perhaps a little bit time consuming in practice. And at times it's a bit more conceptual than it is practical. The indicators need to be ADAPT, but no actual ADAPT candidate indicators are presented. And that would really help this report. Specific applicability, it could apply, or parts of it could apply to broad, well-established development, multi and bilateral programs in various sectors that need to consider some candidate indicators for climate change adaptation interventions. And in that sense, I would say the applicability would be perhaps similar to the UNDP framework. The 6th report and framework is IIED, Climate Change Working Paper 1, Tracking Adaptation and Measuring Development. And I want to start with a quote from the report, and that goes as follows. Most climate change response evaluation frameworks essentially assume that adaptation can and will neutralize the impacts of climate change, enabling development to meet targets that were originally set without any reference to the potential impacts of climate change. In other words, targets set under assumptions of a stationary climate. Such frameworks underestimate the potential need for transformative change. And having heard my previous presentation of the previous frameworks, I do not really feel that any of them assume that adaptation will neutralize the impacts of climate change. I'm not so sure about it, but it is the first time transformative change is on the forefront. And that is an interesting approach taken in this report. The report proposes an approach to the evaluation of adaptation success that combines the assessment of how well climate risks to development are managed by institutions, and those are the upstream indicators, and that's basically the triangle pointing down, and combine them with the assessment of how successful adaptation interventions are in reducing vulnerability and keeping development on track in the face of changing climate risks. And those are downstream indicators, and that's the triangle that's facing up. So it's combining a upstream and a downstream approach. And I see it says both track 1 upstream, and I don't think that's completely correct. One is moving from the local level up and the other one is moving from the global to the national level down. The aim here is to provide a framework that defines indicators, categories or domains, and that's very much in line with the UNDP framework, that can be tailored to specific contexts rather than a toolkit for monitoring and evaluation that prescribes particular indicators. Interesting as well is that they use a different way of categorizing climate change adaptation indicators, interventions. And this is interesting, but it doesn't have a real big effect on the M&E of such interventions. It categorizes adaptation interventions by those addressing the adaptation deficit, resilience building, those adapting to incremental changes, climate proofing, and those adapting to qualitative changes, transformational change. It's a very readable and clear document. It's easy for the reader to get a quick grasp of the essentials of the framework. And it should be relatively easy to apply in various contexts. The report is split into a clear background framing part and evaluation framework section. Disadvantages are that it doesn't cover all aspects of climate change adaptation interventions, so the reader would need to have a good understanding already of this before using the framework. It doesn't touch much upon the M&E learning aspect, and no indicators are presented and limited guidance is given on the development of indicators. No step-by-step approach is presented for the implementation of the framework. On the applicability, preferably programs that either are at a local or subnational level but part of a national strategy, or programs that are focusing on a higher level policy development and incorporate the concept of developing activities on lower levels as part of the policy being developed. This gets us to the seventh framework being reviewed, called Making Adaptation Count, Concepts and Options for Monitoring and Evaluation of Climate Change Adaptation by GIZ in collaboration with the World Resource Institute. The core principles presented in this report center around the importance of M&E as a tool to shape successful adaptation efforts. But it also recognizes that M&E can serve other useful purposes. For example, it can help identify positive synergies between efforts towards adaptation and other objectives, such as economic growth or climate change mitigation. Competing priorities for how to use M&E can create tensions that practitioners must face in order to design effective M&E systems for adaptation. These include whether M&E supports bottom-up or top-down decision-making, and whether M&E as a tool for learning can be reconciled with its role in supporting accountability. Three principles underpin effective M&E systems for adaptation interventions, being it's designed for learning, it's managed for results, and it maintains flexibility in the face of uncertainty. And I do really appreciate the combination of these three. Results focused, but learning and flexible. And it is actually the first report that really comes with a step-by-step approach to develop and use your M&E system. Step 1 is to describe the adaptation context. Adaptation depends heavily on context. It's essential for practitioners to understand the climate and non-climate factors and populations that will affect and be affected by the planned interventions. Conducting a climate vulnerability or climate risk assessment early in the intervention design process helps. Step 2, identify the contribution to adaptation. Adaptation is many things to many actors. An attribution of any given set of activities to a known outcome is impossible. Instead, this paper proposes a three-part framework constructed around possible contributions to the adaptation process: adaptive capacity, adaptation actions, and sustained development in a changing climate. Step 3, which is called step 2 here I see, but that is really step 3, form an adaptation hypothesis. To test the validity of an approach to adaptation, practitioners can formulate an adaptation hypothesis for each major expected outcome. Let me see if I have an example. For example, crop diversification might be a strategy for a farming village to manage increasing climate variability. The hypothesis might be that the use of a particular seed blend will reduce crop sensitivity to extreme temperatures and drought, thereby improving average yield and overall average food security. Step 4. Create an adaptation theory of change. Step 5. Choose indicators and set a baseline. Choosing appropriate indicators for adaptation requires rooting an intervention's goals with its specific climate change and development context. The adaptation dimensions can be used to characterize indicators by type of outcome and set a baseline to measure progress within each dimension. And then 6, it also gives information on how to use the Adaptation M&E system. It's a real good attempt at providing a practical framework after some useful discussion of the M&E for climate change adaptation interventions. It's clear there's a step-by-step methodology, including theory of change components, and good explanations for choosing indicators and establishing baseline. It focuses as well on M&E learning. It makes mention of integration with existing indicators and M&E systems and components. The disadvantages might be that you need to have a good M&E understanding to appreciate the document to the full. But I would say that's not necessarily a disadvantage. Maybe there is insufficient discussion on the consideration of M&E levels, being global, national, subnational, local, community and household levels. But it should be able to be applied to various contexts by experienced M&E practitioners. And I am looking forward to see some cases on its application. The good thing is that this framework is actually being used in a good number of GIZ programs, and given the way it is written, its use is certainly not limited to GIZ-funded programs and projects. And that gets us to our last toolkit. And I'm looking at Paul. Paul, how am I doing with the time? I'm doing reasonably okay with the time here. And the last one is Adaptme, Toolkit for Monitoring and Evaluation of Adaptation Activities by UKCIP. Adaptme will help you think through some of the factors that can make an evaluation of adaptation activities inherently challenging and equip you to design a robust evaluation. You will be able to use this toolkit to tweak a single part of your existing evaluation design or use multiple tools and parts of it to build a new approach. It starts with looking at the purpose of your evaluation, which feeds into the type of evaluation being planned. And it can be one type or it can be a combination thereof. First could be to evaluate effectiveness, outputs and outcomes, or to assess efficiency, costs, benefits, risks on a timeline, to understand equity, or to provide accountability, to assess outcomes, also longer terms, or to provide learning, to improve future interventions, also an important learning part there, or to compare with other interventions. And it also comes with some guidance on how to compare with other interventions. Having established the purpose of your evaluation, the why, and considered the type of evaluation, they look at what it is that you are evaluating. And they make a difference between building adaptive capacity, which involves developing the institutional capacity to respond effectively to climate change, or delivering adaptation actions, which involves making practical actions to either reduce vulnerability to climate risks or to exploit positive opportunities. And that may range from simple low-tech solutions to large-scale infrastructure projects. And the interesting thing is that they do talk you through a development of an adaptation logic model. And this example shows a commercial property overheating project. And it's interesting because it's the first time that step-by-step a logic model has been thought through. The advantages are that there are 10 clear steps. They follow the logical framework approach, and it should be easy to follow them. There's a logical framework approach example presented and discussed, and differences are presented between building adaptive capacity and delivering adaptation action and related M&E. Links to reference documents are presented per topics, and that's very useful. It gives a good integration of M&E learning into the framework, but there is little explanation or consideration of climate change adaptation intervention background in the framework. It's a little generic and not really clear how long it would take to complete the 10 steps for a climate change adaptation situation in reality. It's a useful step-by-step approach, following the logical framework approach, to apply once the overall context has been analyzed, documented and understood. It's probably one of the few ready-to-go tools, together with the previous document that I discussed of GIZ. And that's the 8th, and a moment to reflect with this picture. Eureka! An evaluation culture has finally been grown in the lab. Hey, look, these guys are forming a subcommittee. No, wait, they're just disputing the results. Now, if we only could figure out how to grow this in the real world. And that is actually the first point in summarizing that most of these M&E frameworks and approaches discussed are virtually untested in the field for particular sectors. And if they have been used, then results often have not been shared. What is shared is the results of the evaluation, and what's not shared is the actual process of using the M&E framework. And it would have been interesting if we would see some more process analysis of, for example, the UNDP framework, or the GIZ step-by-step approach, or the UKCIP approach. Secondly, it's difficult to really compare them as they apply to different size climate change adaptation scenarios, and though most are multi-level, they apply best to certain policy or program levels. They are generally complex and introduce several monitoring and evaluation concepts, and then present them as a framework package. And there's little mention of likely implementation timeframes when you would attempt to apply them, to implement them. There is very little how-to in the frameworks, particular steps to readily apply the framework to an intervention, with the exception of both the GIZ Making Adaptation Count document and the UKCIP Adaptme toolkit. And a few mention M&E learning, which is positive, but again this is untested, and climate change adaptation interventions bring particular M&E learning challenges. And the last slides, these are 4 slides, I will go through them pretty quickly, but I will make sure that they will be online with all the text with it as a note, so you can read the underlying discussion here. I want to go through a number of key issues involved in evaluating climate change adaptation interventions, but I'm going to do it pretty quickly because I would like to take some time as well to have a Q&A session. So the first point would be that there are different definitions of adaptation. A crucial starting point in the evaluation of adaptation is to define the term adaptation and then clarify what might constitute good or successful adaptation. And if adaptation is understood as a decision process rather than a specific action or a series of one-off decisions, then evaluation tools are needed not merely to inform or justify single decisions, but to assist decision makers and those who have a stake in the outcome of their decisions. If adaptation is understood as an outcome, for example, of climate change resilient development, then evaluations would logically need to focus on the long-term effectiveness of development decisions in the face of the changed climate. And process-oriented adaptation versus results-oriented adaptation or actions linked to outcomes versus social learning. There are various ways to look at adaptation, and these need to be clear when you set up your M&E framework, and these need to be clear to all stakeholders. Adaptation and adaptive capacity. Does adaptation lead to increased adaptive capacity? Alternatively, does increased adaptive capacity increase your ability to adapt? Adaptive capacity is often used as a characteristic of a system and its ability to adjust to climate change on its own. Thus, that would imply that adaptation will increase this ability. But it is worth just thinking about it when you're talking about adaptation, adaptive capacity, and the ability to adapt. The third point is that there is a wide variety of types of adaptation, and these that I show here are just a few examples of what can be seen as an adaptation intervention. So all of these have different scale considerations, process and outcome type activities, and some focus on building adaptive capacities, others on direct intervention which deliver adaptation actions, such as physical infrastructure. And some adaptation programs may cover several of these elements. A fourth point that also came back in almost all of these documents and frameworks discussed, successful adaptation, what is it? And here are a number of pointers on successful adaptation taken out of a number of these reports. I'm not going to talk through them completely, but just for you to see. Point 5, dealing with maladaptation. While the measurement of success is important, it's also important to measure failure. What are the risks of vulnerability? Not reducing, but increasing. Processes are not linear, and stagnation or reversal might be possible. Do short-term successes guarantee long-term successes? And then point 6, the nature of adaptation. There are long time scales. There's a moving baseline presented by climate. There's a mix of hazards and opportunities. And adaptation is multisectoral, and the involvement of a large number of agencies and delivery partners at different scales is often the case. Attribution. Decoupling climate change risks from other drivers and stressors is very difficult, and at times it's perhaps impossible. In calibration, the climate is not the only changing variable. Both adaptive capacity and vulnerability are dynamic and multidimensional, related both directly and indirectly to a range of environmental, social, economic and political factors that change over time. And with that, I would like to end my talk here. And I see that Paul is writing quite a bit, so I'm sure there are some questions. Then one of the first one is, do any of the documents tools provide guidance for participatory M&E? Yes. I have to be honest that reading through the 8, I have to go through them quickly to see which ones very particularly put it out there. I have to say, from the top of my head, learning to adapt, the monitoring and evaluation approaches in climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction. One of the points of ADAPT is the P, is participatory, and it recognizes adaptation as a context-specific process and the need for triangulation of information and decision-making in a participatory way. So number 5, learning to adapt, clearly is participatory. And I also believe that number 7 is looking at participatory. Yes, because the types of adaptation efforts that are used in the Making Adaptation Count report of GIZ is split into 3 different types of efforts, being national policy, community-based, and program and project, which all 3 overlap with each other. And the community-based and program and project components are highly participatory. So those 2 from the top of my head really clearly have participation on the forefront. I would say, I'm not 100% sure, but the Adaptme toolkit is very much about learning. I would say that that one probably has some very clear participatory elements in it as well. I'm looking at the other questions that Paul is handing me. What frameworks, perhaps not mentioned here, would be suitable for the communities themselves to use, given limited capacity and resources? That's a very good question. And I have to say, yes, all these 8 frameworks that are presented here do assume a pretty high level of understanding of both climate change adaptation, climate change, and M&E. Where some are more M&E heavy, others are more climate change heavy. But I would say that all of these would need someone to guide communities through the implementation if they wanted to use any of these 8 frameworks. I would say that the last 2, being GIZ, Making Adaptation Count, and the UKCIP Toolkit, would perhaps be the easiest one because they are really step-by-step approaches. But still, the GIZ one is very M&E heavy in the sense that you do need to have a little bit of an M&E understanding to go through it. And the UKCIP one, I would say as well that you would need someone to guide you through the process. Then I see another question here. What do you think would be most suitable at a local government level? And I have to say again, that probably would be the last 2. The one of GIZ and the one of UKCIP. I would in that case also look at the IIED climate change working paper. That was number 6 that was mentioned. Because they look at a upstream and downstream process. And I'm assuming when you talk about local government, you talk not just about policy development, but also about actual actions, adaptation interventions on the ground. So then I would say it would be good to look at the IIED Climate Change Working Paper 1, Tracking Adaptation, Measuring Development. One question is, any cost-benefit analysis in these frameworks that can guide successful adaptation? As said, there are various ways at measuring success, and looking at the effectiveness in financial terms is one way, but it's not the only way. If you want to measure successful adaptation, then you have to do that on a range of indicators. Cost effectiveness, efficiency is only one. Equity, whether or not there's no inequity with respect to the results of your intervention. Flexibility, how far can you adapt? Are you achieving the objectives, not taking into account the cost element? Then legitimacy, is it accepted by all the stakeholders? And then how sustainable is an adaptation project beyond the project timeline? So there are much more angles towards looking at successful adaptation, and cost effectiveness is one, and in a number of reports it's taken into account as a measure. It is an easy measure as well to compare projects with one another, but you have to be careful doing that as well, because it doesn't take into account all the other measures of successful adaptation. And I see another question coming here from Paul's side. Does any of these frameworks also address mitigation along with adaptation? That is a very good question. Paul, you have read through all of these as well. Did you come across a mention of mitigation in any of these? I can't remember myself.
No, I can't recall actually of the 8 documents.
And it does happen more that there is a mixed viewing of adaptation and mitigation, which I do highly applaud. But looking at mitigation MRV systems, what I quite often hear as being problems in mitigation MRV has quite often to do with stakeholder involvement and with the level of participation and the fact that the MRV systems are over levels going often from a regional to a national to a local level. And that is quite often the biggest issue I hear with respect to MRV systems implementation, which is also a point that is touched upon, the involvement of stakeholders, the participatory element, and the fact that it needs to be carried by a wide range of stakeholders to be successful. That is discussed here with these adaptation frameworks, but as such it's not mentioned that it is also applicable to a MRV system approach. Then I have a question here, which framework is most oriented towards capacity building? And the question I would have here is, do you see capacity building as learning, or do you see capacity building as capacity building of the organization, capacity building towards the M&E system? I'm not entirely sure what the link is that is being made here. If it would be with learning, then I would say that UKCIP puts learning quite at the forefront of its model. That was number 8. So that one, from the top of my head, is one that is very strongly focusing on learning. And I'm looking now at the other ones. And actually I have to not forget number 7, the GIZ making adaptation count approach, which has one of the 3 principles of adaptation M&E being learning. So I would say the last 2 again focus most on learning, and with that I would say focus most on capacity building, because there is a feedback loop that looks at feeding back the results of the M&E into the intervention. And I see another question coming to me. Paul, do you still have enough paper to write them down?
No, I'm running out. I'm actually kind of summarising some of the questions coming through to get the meaning, so we can answer them quite quickly in this webinar. So
one I have here, another question: do the documents frameworks what does it say? Suggest useful ways for dealing with the challenges relating to long-term time frames? That is a very good point. And I would say that IDS Sussex GEF-DFID Evaluation of Adaptation to Climate Change from a Development Perspective, that's publication number 2, they do mention that they look at long-term time frames, and we're talking about multiple decades. So that's in that framework, that's number 2, a point that's made very clearly. And I'm going through the rest of them, and I don't think that the really long-term time frames. Yeah, you could see that in the IIED paper, Climate Change Working Paper, Tracking Adaptation and Measuring Development, that's number 6, looking at adapting to qualitative changing, the transformational change part, that does imply that it's long-term, what is being looked at, the fact that it is, the type of action is transformational change. So I would say number 2 and number 6 really look at a really long time frame, which doesn't mean that the others can't be used on longer time frames, but they do not put them forward as much as those 2 publications. Do any of the M&E frameworks build on each other? That's a very good question. And I have to say that actually all of them, apart from the first one, because UNDP came out first with their framework, they all build on each other. And that's quite interesting. And that's why I actually framed them from number 1 to number 8, going through time in this way, because they do build on each other. I'm quite happy that number 1 is UNDP proposed framework, because it's quite well developed for a framework that didn't build on anything else, that came out of the blue, basically. In that sense, I have to say it's quite an achievement what they made. After that, the IDS Sussex development perspective, yes, that one follows as well the UNDP proposed framework. And as said, the UNFCCC looks at the vulnerability reduction assessment of the UNDP. After that, we have Haris Sanahuja's Tracking Progress for Effective Action, which is not a framework but a draft study of all the previous frameworks. So that's number 4, which basically takes into account all the previous ones. And number 5, yes, as well. Yeah, I have to say all of them built on the previous ones. In some way, sometimes trying to find a niche or trying to, I don't know, take down a little part of previous frameworks, and in other times really constructively building onto previous frameworks. And I'm looking at Paul for the next question. Okay, do any of the frameworks evaluate the impacts of an intervention beyond the wider target beneficiaries? That is a good one. And I have to say that really depends on the approach you're taking. If you are looking at purely the outcomes, because a number of these approaches, they don't just look at outcomes. They give a number of options. They say, okay, we have indicator types, some are process, some are outcomes, some are behavior, some are welfare, some are bigger than that, some are longer term, some are short term within this project time frame. In that sense, yes, they do look beyond the wider target beneficiaries if you're talking project, but not in a sense that is the main approach that they take. They do take it into account, but it's not in the sense. Yeah, I'm thinking about it right now. It's not in the sense that they would actively be advocating impact evaluation, which, now that I'm thinking of it, is a bit strange. I'm not saying that impact evaluation always looks beyond the wider target beneficiaries, but you will be looking at quasi-experimental setups with control groups quite often. So in that sense, yes, some of them look beyond the wider target beneficiaries, but it's just a part of the type of evaluation approaches that they are setting out. And I see another question coming to me here. Do any of the frameworks look at how adaptation M&E systems can be integrated, harmonized with other development M&E systems to avoid duplication? Yes. The first one actually, in a way, already does that, because it is developed towards the Special Climate Change Fund and the Least Developed Countries Fund. And the LDCF is not a specific 100% climate change fund. It looks at responses towards water resources, land, agriculture, health, infrastructure development, disaster preparedness. So already the UNDP proposed framework takes into account that climate change is not something on its own. The second one, IDS Sussex, clearly says adaptation to climate change from a development perspective, which means mainstreaming it into development, climate-proofing development. If I then look at number 5, learning to adapt, also has a strong look at mainstreaming it into development and disaster risk reductions. It looks at the 3 points: climate change, disaster risk management, and development. So also there, it doesn't just stand on its own. IIED, tracking adaptation, measuring development, the title in itself already says it. It looks at it from a development performance perspective and doesn't take climate change M&E as a system on its own. So I would say most of these, yeah, also GIZ and also UKCIP, they look at it in the broader picture of development. And another question coming to me. Which of these frameworks gives us the best list of practical indicators, especially applied to the local village level? I would say that the recap report, Tracking Progress for Effective Action, framework for monitoring and evaluating adaptation to climate change, is a good start for a simple reason that it recaptures each and every indicator that is presented in the 3 frameworks before. If I then look at the, let me see, IIED. No, it's not it's tracking progress, number 4, and number 5, the learning to adapt report, where the current approaches are split by M&E methodology. And their indicators are linked to different types of M&E methodology, and there are also a number of local level indicators. So 4, 5, and then again reports 7 and 8, making adaptation count of GIZ and UKCIP. I would say they do give guidance on local level indicators. I don't say that they necessarily give a long list of indicators, but they do give guidance on how to develop indicators for a local level as well. And I see Paul is writing quickly, and I'm going to take a moment to drink some water. And I thank you for your patience. How well do the frameworks deal with uncertainty? And how well do we understand that the intervention adapts to change? I'm assuming that it means how flexible is the intervention to adapt to change, in the sense that there is uncertainty, and when you've set a baseline for a project and you start then implementing a project, that during the implementation your whole idea and your assumptions might change, and with that you need to change your approach. There are a number of reports who do that, and I have to say uncertainty here is in no way the same as maladaptation. The two are often linked, but not necessarily the same. I am quickly scanning through them. I would say that GIZ making adaptation count, because one of the core principles of the framework is to maintain flexibility in the face of uncertainty. So going through the 8, I would say that one is the one that is takes the most flexible approach to take into account uncertainty. And I'm looking at Adaptme. Yeah, no, I think that it is the GIZ making adaptation count approach that gives most flexibility towards your design. Are there any other questions? Are there any questions that we haven't answered? I'm going through the questions now myself. Let me see. At 4:59 p.m. there was a question. National level adaptation initiatives may not work at times because of cross-boundary changes in the environment, particularly water resources. For example, withdrawal of water from natural water bodies like rivers in the upstream beyond the geographical boundary of the country. How to deal with such situations? That is a difficult one. And I work at the moment from Cambodia, and we are all aware of the upstream downstream situation here with respect to the Mekong River and Mekong Delta, the building of dams, how that will influence changes in the environment, in the water resources downstream. It is very hard to take that into account in any of these frameworks, to be honest. It doesn't, but then again, it doesn't necessarily mean that national level adaptation initiatives do not work. It is true that cross-boundary changes in the environment will impact the NAPAs, but I would say if you develop scenarios around what can happen, around assumptions that you have on the development over the next 10 years, then you can come to scenario planning approaches where you can take into account things like that happening. Then again, if you then plan interventions, the question is if you are really going to plan an intervention that takes into account the worst case scenarios, because that of course does cost a lot of money to follow worst case scenarios, and quite often you look at balanced scenarios. If then worst case scenario would become reality, diminishing body of water downstream then being perhaps the worst case scenario, then it is possible that the outcome of NAPAs will be less than you would have hoped for. I would say that at such a point you still have an output. It's not that there is no need for a NAPA anymore, or that there is no output because there are changes. I would say you still have an output. It is that you are working with a changing environment, not just the climate change, but also the context in which you're working. And I would say that if you then measure the success of the adaptation intervention, then you have to look at it in the context of the changed environment that you are confronted with at that point. But I would say at that level, all of the frameworks discussed, the last ones, number 7 and 8, they do take into account changes in context, and they do look at flexibility. But there is a limit to the level of flexibility they can incorporate, and this might be one of those limits. And another question here. I do hope that answers the question. I know those are very difficult questions, and I don't have an answer for them, how cross-boundary changes impact programs like that, because the impact is quite big, and yeah, no, I couldn't answer that from behind my computer here. Another question, where do you see the greatest need for improvement? What has not been addressed in the framework so far? I would say, especially looking at how they developed over time and looking at the last two, that most of it has been addressed. I do not see incredibly big gaps. What we need now is that people are willing to step up and use them, that organizations are willing to step out of their comfort zone, that also donors are willing to invest a little more in their M&E practice and invest a little more in the M&E of the programs they sponsor. But it's not just the donors, it's also the organizations who need to make a choice to want to review and revamp their M&E system. Because a number of these issues that are put forward here, they are not unique towards climate change adaptation interventions. We should actually learn from the process as well in normal M&E of development programs. at times we just don't. The learning feedback, the loop back into the program for adjustments, it just doesn't happen that often. In that sense, I do not think that there are points that are not addressed in these frameworks. I do think that we just need to step up and actually start implementing some of these points that have been made here. And yeah, that might cost a little bit of money, but I also think that organizational learning needs to be much more put to the forefront. Another question, often projects are only 3 to 5 years implementation, but one cannot say yet if the outcome has been achieved, as adaptation is a long-term process. How do we evaluate that? And that's true. It is true that quite often you look at your output and you look at your outcomes in 3 to 5 years, but there's no one going to go back there in 20 years from now to see if that momentarily increase of adaptive capacity of a village, if that had any longer term impact on adaptation. How do we evaluate that? I would say that there is a role for regional and global organizations who sponsor those types of projects to also invest more in longer term M&E research. It then becomes, it's not just standard M&E practice anymore, it's long-term M&E research. And I do see a change there. I do see that organizations do see the importance of long-term M&E research, and it does start to happen. I don't think any of the implementing organizations will necessarily take a lead on that. Do any of the frameworks provide suitable example indicators and field interview questions? Yes, as said, the recap report number 4 and the last 2 reports of GIZ and UKCIP do give a lot of example indicators. They do give a good amount of feedback on how to develop your indicators, but none of them give you field interview questions. That's really something you still have to do yourself. And I don't think it's such a big step to go from example indicators to actual field interview questions. I personally do see perhaps a market to develop some kind of an indicator database where you can choose a certain sector and a certain level, being local, subnational, national, regional, or global. And then you get a list of indicators. They are not very incredibly specific, but they just give some context on how to measure them and what they are telling. Perhaps there is a market for something like that. And with market, I mean that there is a need to develop some kind of an indicator database where people can work from. I know it exists in other fields. It exists in education, and it does exist in healthcare. And I wouldn't know why it couldn't exist in adaptation and resilience. Another question, which would be the most suitable to monitor the success of national adaptation strategies? Yes, that's a good one, because actually the first one, the UNDP proposed framework, really has policy and planning as an adaptation process. So it does give a bit of guidance on policy level, on the national level. And reading through it, yeah, Harris Sanahuja and Tracking Progress does give a bit of a hand there as well. And maybe IIED, the Climate Change Working Paper number 6, Tracking Adaptation and Measuring Development, because it looks at an upstream, downstream approach, that one might give some guidance as well on measuring the success of national adaptation strategies. Having said that, there is still a lot to learn, and there's still a world to win when it comes to the measuring of the success of any type of policy, especially if you look at it from a from a participatory perspective. It is not that people go into the villages and then see whether or not any of the interventions that have taken place were in line with a national adaptation strategy. It would be interesting to see some more work being done there, that people are asked, do you know there's a national adaptation strategy? Do you know there is that the local council adapted their planning towards these strategies? Do you think it aligns with the plans that are being made here? That doesn't happen all that much, or at least I haven't seen it happening, or I haven't seen the results of it. And I would like to see more learning from the M&E of policy development. And having said that, that is going to happen at IDS March 5 to 6. That is in a good month from now. There will be a learning from climate change 2-day session, and it is mainly for a bit higher level M&E and climate change practitioners to exchange knowledge there. And from that we will also do a webinar on the 7th. That still needs to be planned, but we will be doing a webinar there, and it will also focus on climate change policy. I'm not sure in those 2 days we will get to any understanding on that everyone agrees to on measuring success of policy. And I see 3 more questions laying here in front of me, and I am going to make that the last 3 questions because it is getting later, and in about 10 minutes the webinar software will be closing. One question here: which of the reviewed frameworks provide most guidance to donors, implementers on performance management of programs, and how to incentivize performance and corrective actions? Which of the reviewed frameworks? That's an interesting one. I would say, I'm wondering, yeah, I wouldn't put donors there. I would say implementers maybe on performance management. And are you managing the performance of the programs, or are you managing the performance of the people who are implementing the programs? That's a bit a question that I'm having with that one. There is none of them here that measures the impact of incentives or corrective actions towards performance. So in that sense, I can already tell you that's in no way measured. Having said that, I would say that learning from M&E, number 7, making adaptation count by GIZ, and number 8, UKCIP Adaptme toolkits are the ones where learning is quite on the forefront. So those 2, I would say, if you look to learn from your M&E and feed it back into your program, yes. But looking at it as performance management, no. One more question. There seems to be a lack of applied M&E case studies. Do you know of any? I know of a few, and the GEF has a database of them as well, but most of those in the database are really on a national, regional level, so they are really big programs that are GEF sponsored. They are not like the small INGO, local NGO, civil society organization, awareness creation, capacity development, or adaptation implementation M&E case studies. There are some coming out more and more. The downside I see in these case studies is that no one likes to throw out the dirty laundry. So what you will see is that there are a lot of successes always in any case study, and it is hard for people to actually say, okay, there was maladaptation, or okay, we actually had some failure, and that is a pity. That also comes down to that they are afraid that donors won't sponsor them anymore. But we have to understand that perhaps in reality 70% of all programs are actually only successful, but I don't see 30% of the programs being reported as being unsuccessful. And that is a pity, because actually those 30% are the programs we can learn probably the most from as well. I will look for more M&E case studies on adaptation because I haven't really done a big search on them as well. And what we could do as community of practice is as well to get some of these cases out there from our community members and then make them non-specific, that they can't be traced back to a program or organization, and just come to some kind of learning lessons from case studies that we then just provide that can't be tracked down to organizations. Maybe that would be a way to make organizations more open to share. And the last question of the day, and I'm sorry that this is the last one, and I do thank you for hanging in there with me, all 77 that are still here with us. How do the adaptation frameworks differ from normal M&E? For example, in other sectors frameworks. Actually, and I had a big discussion with this with Bruce Ravensloot of Tango, and I'm scanning down if Bruce is there. No, he's not there. I'm not scanning for him because I'm afraid to talk about it. I was just wondering if he was there because he would smile if I would say this. But actually, the adaptation frameworks should not differ from normal M&E, because in normal M&E, if you look at agriculture or water or health or disaster risk reduction, you should also look at the process. You should also look at if there is a process of behavioral change. You should also look at capacity building and awareness. You should look at all of those things. You should be flexible. If it turns out that you're implementing a health program and it's just not there, the need when you start implementing, you need to be flexible enough to make adjustments and to adjust your program. So in that sense, none of these introduce incredibly new things. Yes, it should be participatory. Yes, it should really measure what we are doing. Yes, there should be learning. There should be feedback. It should be results-based. It should be flexible. And normal M&E should be as well. It just often isn't. Having said that, there are some points that weigh a little heavier here. And the first one would be that because we just start doing this in adaptation and in resilience, there is a lot to be learned from the process. We have M&E examples from education and healthcare for 30, 40 years, and there has been a continuous learning effort going on already for a long time. That has not been the case yet with climate change adaptation interventions. So we do need more process focus to learn from. And a second point would be that when you look at adaptation, if you look at enhancing adaptive capacity, it's all about a change in behavior. Well, not all, but a lot is about changing behavior. So you will perhaps have more behavioral change. But then again, risk behavior in health sector, dropouts in school, that also has to do with a change in behavior. And that also should be measured in that way, but sometimes it isn't. So in that sense, nothing new is introduced. There might be a bit more of a focus on the process and behavioral change aspects in adaptation interventions. But all the elements being discussed here should actually also be coming back in a normal M&E, in development M&E frameworks. They sometimes just don't. And with that, that is the last question and the last answer. And I would like to thank all of you for having been here with us. And I would like to thank Paul as well for writing very quickly all these questions down and putting them all together. And we hope to see you in our next webinar, which will be still to be planned, but probably March the 7th. It will be looking at learning of M&E, and there will be a focus on climate change policy there. And we are planning end of March, also not yet online, but we are planning a webinar with GIZ on the Making Adaptation Count work that they're doing, because in the last week of March they are having a training on it and a big discussion, and at the end of that we want to recap some lessons learned there. So we will be back to you with that, and for now I wish you a very nice evening, and thank you very much.
Yeah, just to say thanks very much to Dennis for an excellent presentation, and next time I will answer all the questions and he can write them down. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.